Love helping your clients but hate sales and marketing, but somehow you ended up with sales and marketing responsibilities? Then this is the podcast for you. Hi, Chief Nerd Ruben Schwartz here, and I spent a long time learning these lessons the hard way, and I want to help you learn them the easy way by sharing my experiences and talking with brilliant people who have figured out how to hack not just the code, but the sales and marketing process as well. Of course, as a nerdy person who hated struggling with complex CRMs, I had to create my own CRM for people who actually hate selling, which sounds like an oxymoron, but if it sounds interesting to you, check it out at Mimiran.com. That's Mimiran.com. And whether or not you need a new CRM, you'll find proposal templates and sample lead magnets to help you grow your business. Now let's get to it. Today, I'm super excited to have with me Amos Schwarzfarb. That's Schwartz with a CH plus Farb. He's the managing director of Techstars here in Austin and the author of the great new book, Sell More Faster. He's been in sales leadership for more than 15 years, although he did not start out that way. He's had a string of entrepreneurial endeavors, super exciting, and he's lived in Austin since 2008 with his wife and two daughters. He rides around town on one of his 5 bicycles, and it turns out he got his degree in English near where I grew up and where my parents worked at University of Massachusetts. So Amos, welcome to Sales for Nerds.
Thank you for having me. And I think I'm up to 6 bikes now.
6 bikes. See, you got to update your bio. That's what they say about obsessives, right? Like, how many should you have? If I have N, it's always N plus 1.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So Amos had requested some full-bodied dry red wine. So I've got this Coupe Syrah from Santa Barbara County, 2012. Here you go. Have a sip of that and tell me what you think.
All right. Should we cheers?
Yeah, let's do it. Cheers.
Oh, yum. Very good.
This is one of those things, one of my real wine expert friends texted me and said, hey, by the way, here's a link to some deal site. You got to buy this now.
This one.
Oh,
it's delicious. Yeah.
It was really nice, but in my price range. Uh-huh. So
yeah.
Yeah, it really hits the spot. So Amos, welcome. Tell me a little bit how you went from an English major to a sales rock star. Did that happen, I'm guessing, not overnight?
Oh my gosh. No, not at all. And it was, both of those things were sort of not necessarily an intended path. I went to the University of Massachusetts. I sort of went begrudgingly to the University of Massachusetts. I wasn't really thinking I wanted to go to college. It was really important to my folks that I did. So I did. And I went in as a communications major, and it just really quickly, it was just boring to me. And so I was taking an English class, a required English class, a creative writing class. That's my first semester in college. And I loved my professor. I really enjoyed the class itself. And since I really didn't know what I wanted to do when I grow up, I figured, well, this is fun. Maybe I'll just be an English major. And so that's how I became an English major. It wasn't really intentional, but it stuck. And then I did a whole, I went through college. I graduated college and was sort of glad that I loved college, but I was glad to sort of move on to the next phase of life. I moved to California, specifically to rock climb in Yosemite and Tahoe and Joshua Tree and Needles. And
were your parents thrilled that their college investment had paid off with so much rock climbing?
No, they were so unthrilled. There was a period of time. There was 2 different periods of time where technically on paper I was homeless. I wasn't, because I could always go to my folks, or I could go. I had a cousin who lived in San Francisco, but technically I had no place to live. I lived in the woods and in my car, and they were mortified by my lifestyle choices. And I actually found my way into startups before I found my way into professional sales. At the first company the first startup I was a part of was in the late 90s, and it was a retail catalog company, a mail order company. And we took that company online in the late 90s and ended up selling that company. And it was, there were 3 of us in the company. It was never a big company, but it was, that was sort of my foray into startups. And then I was like, great, now I'm going. And it was a rock climbing gear company. So
I was like, how did you get so responsible all of a sudden? Now I understand.
Yeah, I was packing boxes in the guy's garage, and it was just a company out of his garage. And after that, I went back to sort of having jobs that helped facilitate my lifestyle of wanting to just be outside and and climb rocks and bike and stuff. And then I had a chance meeting with a guy in a bar who was by himself, and I was with a group of coworkers, and we invited him to join us. And he was one of the founding members of a company called Hot Jobs, and they were opening up a San Francisco office, and or they might have had a small office and they were expanding it at the time. And I didn't know what Hot Jobs was. I didn't know what they were like. We're getting ready to go public. I had no idea what all that meant. And he invited me to come and interview, and I ended up getting offered a job in telesales, and that was how I started in sales. Although I guess if you look back, I could probably tie a bunch of things together, but I was not good, at least not in the beginning. I sucked, and I was pretty close to losing my job before I made the first sale. But as soon as it clicked for me what I was supposed to be doing in that job, it clicked in a big way, and I was able to very quickly become one of the top salespeople.
If I can summarize your life advice, if you have to go to college to please your folks, it's okay. Just get an English major and get out, then live in a van for a while and invite strangers to hang out with you at bars.
Yeah, don't follow my path.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the rock climbing gear company makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The outdoorsman to telesales leap seems like a bigger jump. Is that not the case? Like, how did you get that? Actually seems like really responsible.
Yeah, it wasn't so much that I was trying to be responsible yet. I think it was more like I couldn't tell you this at the time. I mean, I really have to look back. But there's a couple of things about my personality that I've learned, and one is that I seek the unknown where I can kind of see where it's going, but I don't necessarily know the path there, and I enjoy that sort of adventure. I'm not and I have to thank, both my mother and my father for this, but I'm not afraid of being really committed and going down a path and then realizing I'm wrong and just doing something different. And so it kind of leads into like, risk like that. It doesn't feel risky to me because I'm like, if I don't like it, I'll just do something else. And this might be naive of me, but even now I've never really worried about what's going to happen next. I've always been able to figure out how to, make a living, survive, figure things out. And so, when opportunities get presented to me, particularly professional ones, like it just seemed like a fun thing to do. Like, I haven't done this before. Why not try it?
Okay.
That was really it. It was like, I can always stop.
Right. Great point. Now, you said it kind of sucked and you kind of sucked and then it started to click. What made things click? I think I had a perception of what it meant to be a salesperson when I took the job, and they didn't really give us very much training. It was pretty much like right out of the movie. Here's a phone, start dialing people. And that was, dial. And that shockingly, you were not super successful on the first day.
Right. Yeah. And so I think I had this perception that I was supposed to be a salesperson, like you might think about a car salesperson.
Right.
And so that's what I was trying to do, right? Like just get people to buy the thing that I want without understanding what is it that they need and why do they care. And somewhere along the line, it clicked for me that they had to actually give a shit about whatever it is that they were buying, and it had to somehow bring value to them. And I don't know that I would have been able to express it that way 3 years ago, whatever it was. But that's really what it was, is that I learned that I needed to learn more about who the potential customer was and what drove them, and what were their motivations. And if I can figure that out and be really genuine and sincere in helping to solve some of the things that were for them, that they would be more likely to trust me and then more likely to buy the thing that I was selling them if it was something that they needed. And then the flip of that is it would help me learn, oh, this is not a potential customer. I'm not going to spend any more time here.
That sounds awfully familiar, and longtime listeners will know I often kind of use the same example of thinking of sales as a car salesman and not an honest one, and therefore hating everything, and then having the realization that I'm not here to sell somebody something that's for my benefit. I'm here to help someone get something for their benefit. And lo and behold, sales gets a lot easier.
It's amazing how suddenly, and yeah, I mean, we could talk about that point for hours, but it's because then you're not talking about sales in the way that people typically think about it. You're talking about two people partnering together with a shared goal of solving a problem, and one person has the solution and the other person needs the solution, right? Regardless if it's a very small transactional thing or a consumer product, even like a pair of pants, like someone needs a new pair of pants, you have to sell them the pair of pants that's right for them, not the pair of pants that's wrong for them.
Absolutely. So now you start orienting around the customer, you start actually selling stuff, and then where do you go from there? You had a bunch of ventures that you were part of before you ended up here managing Techstars.
Yeah. So I was at that was at Hot Jobs. I was there for a little over 4 years, and we went through a lot when I was there. Another thing that happened through that process, which again I can reflect back and tell you with conviction about what happened, but at the time I didn't know what was happening. But essentially I got bored selling. I figured out how to do it and do it really well, and it was not exciting to me anymore, and I like and seek new things and adventure and learning. And so I looked around the company, and there were just other areas that were sort of near to what I was doing that needed attention, because we were a very rapidly growing organization. And as anyone who's been part of any growing organization of any size, when one part of the organization starts going well, it usually puts enough pressure on another where something is going to break. And in fact, if things aren't breaking, it means you're probably not growing fast enough, or you're not growing very much. And so one of the parts of the organization that started to break was that my opinion was that our customer churn was too high, and I felt that personally, and I saw that in the office that I was helping to run at the time. And so I raised my hand and said, "Hey, I think we have an issue. Can I try to fix it?" And I fixed it first locally, and then helped fix it across the entire organization. And so I did that, and then we got acquired by Yahoo not so long after that, and I stayed in that organization for a little while. And again, I can reflect back and say this: at the time I didn't realize what was happening, but basically I realized that being inside of a big organization, at least at that point in my life, was not where I needed to be. I needed to feel like I was having an impact across the organization, and that the things that I was doing actually mattered. And I didn't feel like that at all inside of Yahoo. And so I can't remember how long I was there after, but it wasn't very long. But I started, as soon as I started feeling that way, which is probably within 6 months, I started trying to figure out what was next. And so what was next was sort of a chance happening with the founder of a company and an incubator in LA, Jake Weinbaum. He founded this incubator called eCompanies. They spun out a whole bunch of companies, including Boingo Wireless and Jamdat and Icebox and a few others that went on to some really great things. And one of them was business.com. And he and I were riding bikes one day in LA. I didn't know him very well. I didn't know who he was. He was asking me what I was doing. And I was still at Hot Jobs, but I was very much looking to leave. He said, he said, "Hey, let's go for breakfast. I want to talk to you about something." And so we went for breakfast, and he basically said, "I own this URL, work.com, and I kind of have an idea of what I want to do with it, but would you think about working together on something?" And so fast forwarding, I ended up co-founding a company called work.com with him, which we eventually rolled together into business.com, where I took over sales and client services for business.com. And then we grew that company to a lot of revenue, and so eventually sold the company.
Awesome. And then how did you end up at Techstars? And for folks who don't know what Techstars is, maybe give like the brief introduction.
Yeah, sure. So Techstars, what we like to say is we're the global network that helps entrepreneurs succeed. That means several things tactically. The thing that it means for what my job is I run an accelerator here in Austin. We have about 50 of them right now around the world. And I invest through my accelerator into 10 companies a year. Usually they're pre-Series A, although not always. And we work hands-on for 90 days together to help figure out what are the things that are working well, what are the things that are not working well, and how do we optimize growth and a growth path so we can have the most optimal outcome at some point in the future. So I got here actually after we sold business.com. I moved to Austin. I started another company which I sold, and then I joined another company which we sold. And then that brings me to the sixth startup that I was in, which is a company called Joust. And it was the first company that I was a part of that was at any sort of scale that was a failure. But I started the company with a couple of other guys, also serial entrepreneurs, and we raised a couple $1 million before we actually developed the line of code. And one of my investors was the then managing director of Techstars Austin, Jason Seitz. And I knew him because he had invited me to be a mentor when he first came and started running the program here. And so we had gotten very close because we had all these things together. I invested in the companies that he was bringing into Techstars. He had invested in my company. And so when we ended up shutting Joust down, I went and I told him, and we just that resulted in a conversation that essentially got me to take his role over as he moved into a new role inside of Techstars, and that was a little over 4 years ago.
Okay, so you have been a part of 6 startups directly, and then a whole bunch you've been an advisor to through Techstars.
Yep, six startups directly, and roughly 30 as an investor before I became the managing director, and another 39 as the managing director. So a lot of companies, yeah.
So you've seen a lot of what works and what doesn't. I think it's interesting that usually you think of the first startup failing, and then you learn and you do other stuff. But you've shown that even when you really know what you're doing, it's not guaranteed.
Yeah. And I've reflected back on that a lot. I think it was probably, I still feel awful because I had a lot of friends and former investors that had put money into that company, and I still think about that all the time. It really stinks to lose someone's money. But that aside, I look at that as one of the most valuable experiences that I had, and I'm so glad I had it because I think I do this job a lot better because of it. If I had just had a bunch of wins, I wouldn't be able to really empathize and understand what founders go through in the tough times because they wouldn't have been quite as relevant to me. And then I think that the other thing, as I reflect back, like what went wrong, and it was not a thing, it was lots of things that went wrong. One, like no one's immune to it. And two, specifically speaking, I didn't follow my own advice on several things. I believe that I was better than the things that I knew worked, and that we could overcome really obvious challenges that there were more obvious ways to go about approaching it. So for example, something that I really, really preach early on is have a really defined, narrow version of who you think your first customer is, and be maniacally focused on delivering value to that customer. And at Joust, we had 2 types of customers. We had consumers and businesses, and then inside of businesses, we probably had 6 customer types, and inside of consumers, we probably had 15 customer types. And we tried to create something for everybody. And by trying to create something for everybody, we essentially created something for nobody. That is one of many things we did wrong, but that to me was like a really oh, I know better. I have done this before. So that was one of the big ones that I took. There's a lot of things I took away from that, but
and I don't want to dwell on your failures, but I think it is interesting, right? For folks listening, that one, there's no guarantee, no matter how smart and how many times you've done it. And 2, it really kind of adds a lot of, I don't know what the right word is, to the advice you give about finding your niche. It's like, hey, when we did this, it was good. And when we forgot about that rule, bad things happen. What do you know, right? It's not just that things happen by magic. There is a process to follow.
Yeah. And the way that I think about it is that, there are lots of versions of frameworks out there. And the best ones give you the flexibility inside of them to do all the experimentation you need, but the guardrails so that you have a really clear focus on where you should be spending your time.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, I get the concept. Whether I apply it, that's a whole other
Right,
situation.
yeah.
By the way, if you hear a bunch of background noise, we are here at Techstars Austin, which is a very happening incubator. There's all kinds of stuff going on, and people keep peering in the window because they're like, who is this random person drinking wine with Amos in the middle of the afternoon? So,
Yeah.
Anyway, so what made you decide to write Sell More Faster? I mean, that's like the perfect name for a sales book, first of all. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm really excited, and I am completely floored by how well it's being received. I don't know that I expected it or what to expect, but it's been great. The quick version is, and I'm happy to go into any detail if you're curious about it, but the quick version is I didn't really set out to write a book. What I really set out to do was to try to create some simple resources for the founders that I work with through Techstars, and so that I can give them the cliff notes to the things that I've seen work over and over again. And through that process, I got a lot of great feedback to make those cliff notes valuable. And through that process, an editor got their hands on it and thought that there might be an interesting book here, because what we have, when she did her research, there really wasn't a book like this in the market that we could find. And so we decided to put it out there together.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I remember when I started my company, I bought a bunch of sales books because I was like, I don't know jack about sales. Just because I'm a sales consultant doesn't mean I know how to sell anything, right? And they were all, as far as I could tell, please grab some more. They were all for like, I am now the 10,000th salesperson at Microsoft or IBM or whatever. They were not I've started this company. How do I validate my idea? How do I get that nitty gritty stuff? How do I deal with things when I'm selling and delivering and doing all this other stuff? It was kind of like if they were just going to hand me a playbook of things to do, but what about the people who have to write the playbook? And that's where I think this book really shines. So I screw this up all the time because you call it W3, and I'm a nerdy person. So I just want to call it www.sellmorefaster. Every time I read that, my head just automatically does that. But one thing I like about it, it is so freaking simple. Tell us about W3, and hopefully this will just get burned into people's brains.
Sure. The concept behind W3 is that until you really understand who your customer is, what they are buying from you, not what you are selling to them, and why they are buying that, you really don't know how to get to any sort of repeatability. And until you can get to repeatability, you can't get to scaling your company. And so there's an interesting thing that about the book, which is that people automatically assume it is meant for salespeople to learn how to sell more faster. It is, but really this has been written for the head of sales and or more importantly, the founders of companies, right? What do you do at day zero when you think you want to start a company? And what's cool about it is that I believe these principles can apply to big companies that are at scalability, because you should always be questioning yourself so you can figure out how you continue to grow.
There's some great stories in the book about being in companies that had kind of hit a wall because they hadn't gone through this, and being able to sort of like doing this in the air, stitching the parachute on the way down.
Yeah. And these frameworks, especially W3, should allow you to do that. But again, taking my own advice, I wrote the book with the language that I'm using is really for founders that are pre-Series A. So we have an idea of how we want to bring value to some group of people. Now, how do you prove whether you are right or wrong about what you can do? And then how do you get that to repeatability, and how do you scale that? And what do you do once you have happy customers to make them happy? And so just going back to W3, the who is like, how do you most narrowly and specifically define who you believe your customer should be, to the point where you feel uncomfortable that you're narrowing your market and your opportunity. If you feel uncomfortable, it means you're getting closer to the point where you should be. Because once you nail that, it becomes really easy to go to the peripheral markets by simply looking at the criteria of your buyer and then changing one thing or taking one thing away. But until you nail that, till you know that person's going to buy almost every single time, you haven't really nailed it. The what your customer is buying from you, it's a really subtle difference, but it helps you with messaging and developing product. And the example that I use over and over again, because I think it's a really good example, is if of all the products that Google sells, one of them is they sell search advertising on Google.com.
But no one's buying that.
That's not what people buy. They're buying leads. They're buying research. They're buying sales. They're buying customers. That's what they're buying.
Right. So you have this like $800 billion company that sells something totally different than what their customer's buying, but they understand how that equation works.
That's right. And because of that, their product is developed, right? The back end of their product, if you've ever bought Google Search, is developed so that you know the value of what you're buying. They make sure it is very clear the value of what you are buying from them.
Right.
And then the why is about the company, and the why is about the individual buyer and what is their motivation. So are you helping the company make more money? Are you helping the company save more money? If you're a consumer product, you can apply it to like what, you're talking about pants. Why does the consumer care about the pants that you're selling them? What is the why? And then if you're in a company, right, there's the company why, and then there's the individual buyer. What is their motivation? And so the counterpoint that I like to use here is if you're selling to a buyer that is meeting their goals, that is already a top performer, they're not going to get another bonus, they're not going to get a raise, they're not going to get another promotion, then what is their motivation to buy your product, even if it is going to bring value to the company? And there's something there. Right. You have to tease out what that value is going to be to that person in order to make that sale. And then when you tie all these things together, the really beautiful thing that happens is, and this is why it is not just for salespeople, it actually ties your entire company together, right? It gives your company an exact direction of where to go. So product knows exactly what to build. Technology knows how to support product. Marketing knows how to message and market. Everybody comes together with a common vision of who, what, and why, and then you can go win. And I've seen it work personally, and I've seen it work with the companies that I invest in through Techstars.
That's great. And I'm embarrassed to admit that I do a lot of this stuff for a living with my clients. And I'm always preaching and giving great advice and blah, 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 blah. And at the same time, I'm reading this book and I'm like, crap. I thought I was like in my client's face about why they're buying, but that's not close enough. I have to be in their head. Like I do not know as well as I should why they're actually buying. And so I've been doing this stuff for years, and with some modest amount of success. And from talking to my clients, they think this is awesome sauce, right? And I'm like, crap. I've got the who and I've got the what, and I have some issues on the who, which maybe we can talk about depending on how much wine we have. But the why is so important because it's not necessarily obvious what it is, especially like you're saying, a lot of the companies that have the most money to spend, they're hitting their targets. They're doing what they need to do. It isn't like you're saving them from going out of business. There's something else going on that you have to understand. And when you can do it, it's great. I remember when I first moved to Austin, remember Trilogy back in the day?
Yep.
Right? We're like e-commerce for the Global 2000 or whatever, and half the reason people bought stuff was to compete with these online companies. These giant companies were scared out of their minds, and that was the real reason. It wasn't about anything else. And once people figured that out, wow, look, people are spending money like crazy. But we could show all the ROI spreadsheets in the world, and it wouldn't have mattered if we hadn't been able to tap into the actual why. So I think that's great. Now, another thing that it's kind of funny, I just wrote a blog post myself because partly I'm like preaching to myself about this stuff. It's like, how do you know whether you should narrow your niche or expand it? And it's like, the way I realize it is we tend to frame this in negative terms, right? Like, oh, I'm excluding parts of the market. And I was trying to think about how do we frame this in positive terms? And the way I kind of formulated it was, is sales too easy? If sales is too easy and you're bored, maybe it's time to expand your niche. If it's not, and you're frustrated at all about sales, narrow it down.
Oh, I love that. So I'm getting this question a lot. I'm going around the country on a quasi book tour, and I say quasi because what I'm doing is doing workshops instead of book signings, because I don't think there's value in book signings, but I think there's hopefully value in delivering some of the content out of the book hands-on. And I get that this is a question I get a lot. How do you know when to go broader or when to go narrower? I love that answer, and I'm going to borrow that from you if that's okay. The thing that I've been saying, which is very similar, which is you really can't go too narrow in the beginning. You think you can because you're scared you're narrowing yourself. But the point where you know that you need to start to expand is when you start to see repeatability. And repeatability means that when you're having conversations, you're still having the same conversations, but you already know what the questions and obstacles are going to be, and you already know what you're going to say for 80 to 90% of the conversation, for each individual conversation. And when that is happening over and over again, which is your version of you're getting bored, great. Now how do we grow that a little bit? Right. Yeah, we can put the pieces in place to have things be repeatable. How do you grow that? And that's where you're starting to get into that scaling. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I don't know. I've asked myself this. I overanalyze everything, including overanalyzing myself. But part of it is like, why do I have trouble when I want to narrow my niche? I spend all my day telling people to focus, and then what do? And I'm convinced there's something like fundamental about human biology. Like, we're going to go gather nuts from the whole forest, and we hate being restricted to like one part of the forest. Like, it's really deep in there. And so you need a way to convert it into positive psychology, I think, to make it something that you're like, yeah, let me go laser focused.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. One is the fear of what if I'm wrong? The flip danger is, what if you're wrong about going broad? And my experience is more times than not, you're wrong, right? Which means you waste a lot of time and money and you don't go very far. And the other thing is, I think that people need to give themselves a lot more room to make mistakes. Am I allowed to curse on the podcast?
You're allowed to curse.
Okay, good, because it almost came out and I held it back, but I tend to curse a lot. I think people need to give themselves more room to fuck up and be really okay with it, because if you're comfortable with going out and putting yourself out there and doing some things that don't turn out how you hope, you will be much more comfortable with experimenting and realizing that just because they don't turn out how you hope doesn't mean that it's not a really valuable opportunity that you've just had, because you are now learning something about the product that you're selling or whatever it is that you might be doing. And so, again, like, I wouldn't say that I may have been doing this for 2 decades, but I wasn't conscious of it until recently. But I'm trying really consciously now to say there is no such thing as me screwing up unless I consciously do something that I know is wrong and do it anyway. But if I'm just going out and trying to learn something, like, no matter what the result is, if I can say, great, I've just learned something from that, how do I apply that to the future? Right. The application might be, don't ever do that again. That might be enough, but at least I know that. But there's usually other things that you can do. And then sort of another part of that, which I think we're all guilty of, unless you're out of finance or you're an engineer, then maybe not. But understanding how you're going to measure the thing that you're doing, so that you're reasonably sure if it turned out the way you had hoped it turned out, and to do that consciously beforehand. And again, being comfortable with however you're trying to measure it and whatever you're trying to measure, being comfortable with you might have picked the wrong thing too, and recognize that as you're halfway through it. But at least have put a stake in the ground to say, this is where I'm starting from. And this is what I hope to learn. And then if you don't, great. Then you learn something in that process that gets you one step closer to whatever it is you're trying to achieve.
I think that's a great point. And I think something that comes up again and again in this podcast is, when you're in sales, when you're in a sales cycle, a yes is great, a no is fine, and a maybe is awful. And as you're talking, I'm realizing that there's this other level, the aggregate, same thing applies. And this is Sales for Nerds. We're supposed to be nerdy people, but I think there's this human tendency to fuzz things a little bit. And it's sometimes a little scary to get a hard no, but we want to design what we're doing so we get a yes or a no. This, well, maybe is the killer, right? Like, if you spend a week or a month or 6 months or whatever it is disproving that this market works, you've learned something valuable, you can move on. If you've spent that time and you're like, well, I don't know, now you're screwed. You've just completely wasted that time.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a couple of things that struck me as you were saying that. I think, the first one is the fear of getting a no restricts people from getting to an answer a lot as a salesperson.
Yes.
So instead of asking the hard question, like, someone's like maybe, or there's dragging you along, and just, developing the relationship so that you can just say, what would turn this into I need to do this now, or I'm never going to do this. And trying to just have that really candid conversation with, especially in the early days. And when I say early days, like even if you've raised your Series A, you're probably still not at scaling. So you're still wanting to have these conversations so that you can learn, and getting those reasons help you get closer to nailing your W3. The other thing that you said that I loved, which is you use the word disprove instead of prove. And I can't remember if I go deep into this concept.
You do, and I have a highlight in here to
Good.
ask you about.
Awesome.
So we're there.
Yeah, this is great. So this is something that I actually learned from working with Rob Taylor, who's the CEO of Convey, when we worked together at Black Locust. But he has this concept that I love and have adopted, which is once you have proven that you're right, go spend some time proving why you're not right. Be really open-minded to being wrong. And that can take lots of different forms. But the general thing is, okay, I'm pretty sure that we're headed in the right direction. Go spend some cycles figuring out all the reasons why you could be wrong.
Right.
And see if you can't prove why you're wrong, that gives you more confidence in why you're not wrong. And that's going to unleash lots of different, it can unleash lots of different things as you dig into it.
And I think it's kind of like we all get wedded to whatever path we're on, our product, our pitch, our website, whatever it may be, right? And we hate any negative feedback on that, even to our in our own heads. But you're right, like if it's really that important, let's make sure that it's right. And if it's not, let's fix it. And if it is, great, we've run through all these things that are now going to help us deal with objections in our sales cycles.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, for all the entrepreneurs that are listening, the thing that I'll say is like, here is a thought to potentially ground yourself in. There is a current concept of what it means to be an entrepreneur, I believe, which is to start a company and to try to grow something to really, really, really big. The classic version, or the classic definition of being an entrepreneur, means I am starting something with my own hands, and I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that I can provide for myself and my family or my loved ones or whatever that might be. And there's a subtle difference in there, which is the classical version of an entrepreneur forces you to figure out how to build something that sustains your life. And the current definition, if you take that out, doesn't give you the freedom and flexibility and comfort in being wrong a lot and changing where you're going and figuring out how to make it right. And thinking that if I can't optically show people all the time that I'm moving my business forward, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do, which is not correct. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you should be fucking up a lot along the way, learning from your mistakes, and then fixing them and moving forward.
I think that's a great point. And I think part of the problem we have is there's a distortion in sort of the media and the buzz about, and you go into this a bunch in the book. I think you talk about Twitter and Slack and these companies that are, these multi-billion-dollar companies that started out as something totally different. And probably 90+% of the people don't know that. They just think, oh, these guys are geniuses, and the PR teams at those companies are busy pitching about why they're geniuses, how awesome all this stuff is, and not these are a bunch of people who tried to do one thing and it totally failed, but they had this little nugget that turned into something really valuable.
Yeah. I in doing some of the research for the book, I that's where I learned the Slack story, and I was so floored by it that I had to include it because I feel like they deserve so many kudos for being so resilient and so honest with themselves and so curious, right? And so if you don't know the story, Slack started as they started as a gaming company, and they built this feature inside the game. And what they saw was like the game was doing okay, but the interaction and the way people were interacting in this feature was unprecedented. And so they took that feature out and built this amazing company around it. And I think they continue to do that, right? They continue to reinvent themselves and get better and better.
And that's another interesting thing where the guy who started Slack was already a successful entrepreneur, right? He could have been full of ego and said, no, I want to do a video game. And he looked at what was going on and turned it into, for better or for worse, Slack is this juggernaut now, right? Same thing with Twitter. So another thing you say that I think is really useful is you've got this W3 framework, super cool, and you're like, it is useless until you test it. So let's get into testing, because I think a lot of stuff sounds good, right? It's like Mike Tyson said, everyone has got a plan until they get punched in the face. How do you take that punch in the face and figure out how to iterate on it?
Yeah. So just to make sure that we've laid the right groundwork for this. So the concept behind W3 is having a really strong theory of who you believe your customer is, what you believe they're buying from you, and why they're buying it from you. And then basically writing that down, right? Not who you think they actually are, not the companies or the individuals yet, but who, the characteristics of those things. The next step is to go and test it, right? Like go actually prove yourself right, and then try to prove yourself wrong. And the best way that I could describe doing this, is you need to be willing. For anyone who's heard me talk in the last 3 months, you've heard this too many times, but you need to be willing to decide you're going to go dig a ditch in your backyard, and that ditch is 100 feet by 100 feet by 100 feet deep, and you don't get to use a bobcat and you don't get to use a shovel. You got to go use your hands. You have to go out and you have to do the hard work. And until you're willing to go do the hard work, the chances are you're not really going to understand those three things. It may take a long time. It takes some companies years. At business.com, it took us 6 years to figure that out. It takes other companies a lot faster. At Black Locust, I think we figured it out in about 4 months. And there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason. Sometimes you get lucky and you figure it out earlier, and sometimes it just takes a lot of really, really, really hard work.
So I'd like to think that this digging 100 by 100 by 100 hole in my backyard is a metaphor. What is the actual hard work that we need to do?
You need to go talk to customers, potential customers, and surveying them is one thing, but you need to actually go have real conversations with real people, and not be selling them, but be asking them questions and having an understanding of where they are and how do they fit into your theory of what you believe your W3 is, and take them down a path where either it is very clear that they are not your customer, which helps you learn something about the profile you've created. Were you wrong about the person that you picked, or are you wrong about your profile? And if you believe that you're heading down the path that they are your customer, are they willing to actually buy something? And that's where you go from this concept of customer development and you flip into sales. And if they're willing to buy something and actually give you money for something, even better if it hasn't been created yet, and they're still willing to give you money for something, then you're starting to get signposts that you're headed in the right direction. And you need to get a lot of those signposts. And I can't tell you if it's 10 or 100 or 1,000. It's going to depend on your business. It's going to depend on your product. It's going to depend on your customer set. But you need to get people to actually take them down a path where they are recognizing that the thing you are doing is bringing value to them in a way that they need, that they hopefully have a way to measure that, and they are willing to trade some of their value to you. In most cases, that value is money. In some cases, it is not. It could be something else. It could be, PR or testimonials or white papers. But there needs to be something that they're willing to do that requires them to have skin in the game and their reputation on the line.
Great point. And I can't remember if it's Jason Cohen in episodes 1 and 2, or maybe Ash Moria, who were saying that you're done when you actually know what they're going to say again and again and again. Like you've had enough and you've nailed the profile enough that you actually can predict before they say it what's actually going on. They're like, okay, great. We've actually successfully been through this part of the journey. And it's funny because, again, I'm great at preaching and I preach this stuff all the time. Do I always follow it? No, because it's like there's some part of me as an engineer that's so eager to get back to the product that even though I genuinely love my customers and I love their problem, there's like this little piece of me that's like, can I go write some code now? Right? Which I mean, as useful as that is at the right time, it's probably the wrong thing to have like constantly pulling at my brain.
Right. Yeah. I think you nailed it, which is, when can you predict exactly what the conversation is going to sound like over and over again? And then you're truly onto something. Right? And then, I think there's sort of two things in what you said here. One is that your market, one thing you may learn is that your market isn't as big as you think it is. That doesn't mean that you're not a successful entrepreneur. And in fact, lots and lots of people would be happy to build a business that they have a predictable revenue stream and then can learn how to grow it in different ways over time. And that goes to my point of why you want to really narrow who, because it is really easy to add on peripherally to your who once you know who your who is. And I think the other thing that you make me think of is the concept of being okay with being wrong. It's kind of what we were saying before, like, actually a little bit different. Like being okay with being wrong, but like letting yourself off the hook a little bit in that, there are some people that are just technicians, right? And they follow the technique to the 100% letter. And I actually applaud those people. I think that is really, really hard to do. I also think it's okay to let yourself off the hook a little bit as long as you're being honest with yourself, that it is really hard to do everything like a surgeon and perfectly, especially when you're dealing with people and people's personalities and you don't know what kind of day someone has or where they're coming from. And so giving yourself the flexibility to be to have movement and space inside of your process so that you may have a gut instinct earlier than someone else may have the same gut instinct to get back to coding. Trust that gut. Learn how to trust your gut over time, right? And learn the difference between you trying to rationalize a moment and what you're really feeling, a burning desire in your belly.
That's a great point. Thank you. Rationalize. Well, and the nice thing for me is that I'm also a user, right? So unlike when I was writing software for other people, I'm writing software for other people, but also for myself. And so like usually when I have a gut instinct, it's going to apply not just to me, but to others. So anyway, I think you had a great section in this book about sales versus customer development. And I think this is a thing that gets tricky, and you've been kind of talking about it and you didn't know where I was going with this. So I'm not saying you weren't talking about the right thing, but it's like, I want to really call this out because I think it's so important. A lot of people are having struggles with sales because I think they're really doing customer development. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between those two realms?
Yeah, I will. And what I'll start by saying is that I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see startups make is they hire salespeople way too soon. They should be hiring customer development people or doing it themselves. The difference in my mind is that you hire salespeople when you have figured out repeatability. Because great salespeople, you give them the process and you give them the product and you give them the pitch. And there might be 5 or 10% that evolves over time. And in fact, there probably is. But the majority of their job, they know exactly what it is that they're supposed to do. And they are awesome at it. And it is not easy to find people that are great at that and that want to do that and want to do that day in and day out. I was not
the best
one of those
ones
people.
have great jobs making a ton of money somewhere
Career
else.
salespeople are amazing. I'm not one of those people. I can reflect back and say that 20 years later. I consider myself a really good customer development person. I am not a great salesperson because I just get bored. But that's just my personality, right? There are people that love to do that and they're great at it. A customer development person is really all about the exploration and the understanding of trying to solve the challenge of how do I get repeatability. And that takes lots of forms. And the way that I define it in the book is figuring out the W3. So the customer development person's job in my mind is go figure out your W3. And when you can figure that out, then we will bring on a single person that is also a customer development person to help prove you right or wrong.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that make sense, or is that can I go into more detail there? I don't know.
Well, I guess for folks who aren't familiar with the term customer development, how would you define that?
It's, there's definitely a big element of sales here, but there's like a key personality difference and then a way that I can kind of hopefully frame it. The key personality difference is that you're not someone who yearns for repeatability. You're someone who learns for learning and has no ego about the learning that they're doing, that their desire is just to figure out and solve a problem. And you got to be really honest with yourself. Like lots of people are going to, sit here and listen and their instinct might be to say, yeah, I'm that person. And you may be, and you may not be, right? But like really be honest with yourself. Like, are you going to be willing, if it takes you 2 years and 500 conversations to figure out your W3, are you going to be willing to do that? Like, I will tell you, if I have the belief that something is possible, I'm willing to do that.
Right.
I'm willing to have 5,000 conversations because I believe so deeply that it's going to happen, and I don't know where it's going to go.
Yep.
Just be honest with yourself that you're okay with potentially making no money for a long time if you're if you're somewhat commission based because you haven't figured it out. But your job is to figure it out, and you're not going to get frustrated with the product or anything else. You're going to revel in that and get excited about the opportunity unless you lose sight of the vision.
Right.
And someone who I look up to here in Austin, his name's Bill Kennedy, defined me this way once, and I like it because I think it does do a pretty good job of describing how a customer development person thinks, which is they're this hybrid between a product marketer and a salesperson. And I've never have done product marketing formally. I don't even know that I'd be great at hiring that role. Like I know what a great product marketer does, which is they go and they collect research and they figure out like, how do I communicate with my customers, right? But it's this interesting hybrid early on.
So basically customer development is I'm figuring out my W3. Mm-hmm. And then once I have that, I can basically hand a bunch of stuff to a sales rep who can go stamp that out again and again and again and again. But if I hire the sales rep, I've got something stamping the wrong thing.
That's right. And you might hire an amazing salesperson who can come in before your product is mature enough to actually be at that state, and they may be really, really successful at closing customers, and you're going to feel good, and your investors are going to feel good, and everyone that's listening to this podcast has seen the scenarios before where they've seen an early stage company and they have some early traction, and everyone's excited about them, and they're talking about them, and then all of a sudden they flatline. And it might be they flatline at $1 or $2 million in revenue. They might flatline at $7 or $8 million in revenue, but they flatline. And they don't flatline because the opportunity isn't there. They flatline because they've never really nailed their W3 and their churn is really high. Right? And so they're great at getting customers in, but those customers don't stick because because something is missing.
Something
one
there,
of the
but
W's or multiple of the W's are missing.
Okay, great. So on the flip side, you said something really interesting. And it was such an interesting sentence. I highlighted it when I was reading this in the Kindle because it's so true and I fight it constantly. You say process is a liberator. And I think that's such an amazing statement. Right? And I'm always somebody who, on one hand, I'm an engineer, I want a process. On the other hand, I'm like, no, but there's this special case, right? I'm always trying to find some excuse why the process doesn't work. And I think that's such a powerful thing to realize. So once you've done your customer development and you can say, okay, let's stamp this out, process liberates you to go do that in a way you could never do it if you were just doing it on a totally ad hoc basis. So I think that's great.
Yeah. So that was an excerpt from David Brown, who's one of our CEOs. And he's a great process person. And I completely agree with it, which is that when you have process, it frees you up for growth and it frees you up to start being innovative, which really they're sort of similar, right? Like the innovation is what allows you to start to, grow in new ways. It's sort of like, you've been digging with your hands, and the reason you started digging with your hands is because you didn't know what was going to be underneath, and then you learned that underneath there was a bunch of rock that wasn't, that was 5 feet below the surface, but you've got 95 feet to go. And so you realize that rather than bringing in a bobcat, you need to bring in a jackhammer or something like that, right? And all of a sudden you can move really, really fast because you have now the right tools and you know how to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you do it's a little bit of a Zen thing. You have to do the slow work, the customer development up front, so that you can move quickly when it's time.
Yeah. I think that's one of the, I'm curious to see how this will play over time, but the book is called Sell More Faster, and basically what I'm telling everybody to do is slow down to speed up, right? Go do some hard work, because when you do, you will see that rapid growth.
And I've said this before, but it amazes me how many people, they start a company, they're doing something super cool and they're super excited about it and they're struggling with sales. I'm like, well, how many people that know what you're doing right now? Oh, everybody. I sent them an email. How many people have you called to say, hey, I started this thing, we're making the awesomest widgets ever? Oh, 3 people. I'm like, I've just looked at your LinkedIn profile. You have 500 plus connections. You've called 3 of them, right? Let people know what's going on. Do the work, and you have a network built in.
Yeah, and I think in sort of the mid-late 2000s, a lot of people, salespeople, CEOs, marketers, they figured out quick ways to grow. And this concept of hack and hacking growth and growth hackers became really, really popular. And I believe at that time there was such a thing. Now, to back up from that, you can't hack growth until you actually figure out some of those. Either you figure out some of the W's or all of the W's, or you're hacking growth without any long-term retention. I think the tides have shifted a little bit where I'm not sure that I believe the word hacking growth exists anymore, even though people are still going at it. I think you have to go back and step back. And so an example that I'll give you is if you have 500 plus connections on LinkedIn, sending an email to, or an in-mail to 10 or 50 or 100 people at a time that is clearly a form is going to get a really low engagement rate 99% of the time. But if you in-mail each one of those people individually, one by one, and make that personal, your engagement rate will go up. And how do I know this? Because this is what I have done literally at every company that I've ever been at. And people, I get a lot of pushback like, yeah, but it's not efficient. I'm like, I'm not trying to be efficient yet. I'll get to efficiency. I have a lot to learn first.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. And as an introvert, it's so easy to hide behind the technology. And I've been guilty of that again and again and again. And it wasn't until a year or two ago that I was like, you know what? I actually like talking to these people. Like, there's a reason they're in my network. Or if I don't like talking to them, let me get rid of them. But why am I scared to pick up the phone and call these people? Like, every time I call them, I have a great conversation, and I may or may not advance my business in some obviously measurable way. But a lot of times I do. A lot of times they can refer me to someone who will help me do that. And just generally, it's nicer to have a real conversation than to send out a mass email. It doesn't get more introverted than me, and it's just not that bad. It just took me 40 years to realize that.
Yeah. And I think it's one thing to stand in front of a room and talk to lots of people, but most people can have a one-on-one conversation if you can find the one thing in common. And if you are passionate about your product and believe that the person that you are talking to has the potential to be passionate about your product, you have that one thing in common to potentially talk about. And if they're not, you're probably going to learn something either about the way that you talked about your product or the profile of the person that you were talking to, or something in that interaction that will allow you to make the next interaction a little bit better.
Right. And as you say, the W3 is worthless until you until you prove it, / you have to go spend time disproving it. So even getting that negative is useful. And even if you get a blah, I'm not even in that industry anymore, my profile's out of date, you still are just going to have a fun conversation with somebody. That's the worst case scenario.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting corner case, but you get in that same corner case, but you were in this industry. So what would you have thought?
Great. Yeah.
There's no pressure here. I'm not trying to sell you anything. Give me your unbiased feedback. Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And, we could talk about this for hours. This is such a fun conversation, but I want to thank you for first of all, writing this book. Secondly, for taking the time to sit down and have some wine and talk about this stuff, because I think it's super useful. And as much as in my head, I still have to be no, it's W3, not WWW, right? Really understanding the why behind what people are doing. That's really what life is all about.
Yeah. What motivates us all is people. That's right. Yeah.
Amos, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This was really, really fun. And I hope that y'all listening had a good time too. Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you have a friend who would benefit from this episode, please pass the word along. Have a friend who wouldn't benefit, but you haven't talked to in a while, give them a call. iTunes reviews are great to get the word out and help me create the show that's most useful to you. And if you're frustrated with your sales and marketing process or lack thereof, check out Memorand, the CRM for people who hate selling. Until next time.